He is known in history as the Hammer of the Scots for his ruthless campaigns north of the border, and he was one of the most powerful and feared kings of the medieval period. King Edward I was a conqueror and a commander, and he ruled from 1272 to 1307, and he changed the face of Britain forever. He was a prominent castle builder, and when he passed away, the crown of England became much more fragile. In Wales, he built many incredible castles to show his strength, and today he is buried inside of Westminster Abbey, in a plain and modest tomb that does not show his effigy. But over the centuries, this tomb has been opened, and what has been found was remarkable. In this video, we look at the royal corpse of King Edward I, and look at what happened to his remains immediately after his death. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Edward I was born in 1239, the son of King Henry II and Eleanor of Provence. From an early age, Edward's character was shaped by war, rebellion and political struggle. He fought against his father's enemies during the Barons' War and developed a reputation for ruthlessness and determination. When he became king in 1272, while returning from crusade, England was in a state of relative calm, but Edward was not a man who rested easily. He quickly set about strengthening royal authority, reforming the legal system and expanding England's dominion. His conquest of Wales between 1277 and 1283 was one of his greatest achievements. He crushed the native Welsh princes and built a chain of massive stone castles, Carnarvon, Conway, Harlech and others, to secure English control. But after Wales was subdued, Edward's attention turned north to Scotland. There, his ambition to dominate all of Britain would ultimately lead to his death. The Scottish crisis began in 1290, when the death of the young Queen Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, left Scotland without a clear heir. The Scots invited Edward to arbitrate between rival claimants to the throne, assuming he would act as a neutral judge. Instead, Edward saw an opportunity. He declared himself overlord of Scotland and placed John Balliol, a compliant noble, on the throne. When Balliol rebelled against him, Edward invaded Scotland in 1296. He captured Berwick, massacring its inhabitants, and carried off the Stone of Destiny, the ancient symbol of Scottish kingship, to Westminster Abbey. It was a brutal display of English power, but Edward's domination of Scotland was not to last. In 1297, the Scots rose again under the leadership of William Wallace. The shocking Scottish victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge humiliated Edward, though he soon struck back, crushing Wallace at Falkirk in 1298. Wallace was later captured and executed, but rebellion continued to simmer. By the early 1300s, a new Scottish leader had emerged, Robert the Bruce. In 1306, Bruce crowned himself King of Scots, murdering his rival John Comyn in a church in Dumfries. Enraged, Edward I declared Bruce an outlaw and marched north once again to destroy him. By 1306, Edward was 67 years old, a great age by medieval standards, especially for a man who had spent his life in the saddle and on campaign. Yet, despite his age, he was determined to crush Robert the Bruce and end the Scottish threat once and for all. In the spring of 1307, the king set out from London, travelling slowly north. His health was failing, chronic dysentery and exhaustion plagued him, and he could no longer ride his horse for long periods, and his attendants had to lift him into the saddle. Still, Edward refused to stop. He had spent his entire life conquering, commanding and enforcing obedience. He would not give up now. Chroniclers of the time admired his iron will. The monkish writer Walter of Gisborough described how the aging king burnt with wrath against the perfidious Scots and swore he would not return to England until Robert the Bruce was destroyed. Edward even vowed that his bones should be carried into Scotland after his death, so that he might continue to terrorise his enemies from beyond the grave. By early July of 1307, Edward's army reached Borough-by-Sands, a small coastal village just north of Carlisle, near to the Scottish border. The king was now gravely ill. He could barely eat and was too weak to mount his horse, yet he insisted on pressing forwards, hoping to reach the border before he died. On the 6th of July 1307, Edward I died at Borough-by-Sands. The precise cause of his death is uncertain, though most accounts suggest dysentery, a common and deadly disease among medieval armies. He was 70 years old, and according to chroniclers, the king was sitting upright in his tent trying to eat when he suddenly collapsed in his attendant's arms. His death came just as his army prepared to invade Scotland. It was a bitter end for the old warrior who had spent much of his reign trying to bring the northern kingdom to heel. Legend holds that Edward's dying wish was for his heart to be taken on crusade to the Holy Land, and for his bones to be carried at the head of his army into Scotland, so that even in death he said, "I shall be a terror to my enemies," and his servants reportedly promised to fulfil these wishes, though in the end neither were carried out. When news of the king's death reached Robert the Bruce, he is said to have remarked with relief, "Now at last the fox has died, who so often sought to trap me." For the Scots, Edward's death was the end of their greatest tormentor. For the English, it marked the passing of a king who had ruled with both iron and intelligence. Edward's body was carried south from Borough-by-Sands to Waltham Abbey in Essex, where it rested temporarily before being taken to London. His funeral took place at Westminster Abbey on the 27th of October 1307, and he was buried in a plain sarcophagus of Purbeck marble beneath a simple inscription, Edwardus primus Scotorum malleus pactum serva. The Latin phrase translates to Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, keep the vow. The inscription reflected both the king's proudest achievement and his enduring obsession, the subjugation of Scotland. Unlike many other medieval monarchs, Edward's tomb was left largely unadorned. He had ordered that it remain simple, perhaps as a sign of humility before God, or perhaps to reflect his self-image as a warrior rather than a saint. His embalmed body was placed within a wooden coffin and sealed inside of the marble chest. Now, a little more on the embalming of medieval kings. It was a very expensive process, and one which was time-consuming but also ruthless. Straight after his death, physicians would have tended to Edward's corpse, and they would have cut straight down his stomach and taken out his vital organs and entrails. This included his heart, lungs, liver, intestines, and this was done to keep away decay and to prevent the body from rotting quickly and immediately. The cavity left was then washed and was treated with spices and other materials to keep it allegedly fresh. Then the body was washed again, and then wrapped in a thick cerecloth, a linen shroud, which was dipped in wax. This helped to prevent anything getting into the body, meaning that this also secured air out and prevented the body decomposing quickly. In the year 1377, 70 years after Edward's death, this wax cloth was actually renewed to ensure the body of the king remained fresh, and there was money allocated by Parliament to do this. The cerecloth was an important part of the embalming and preservation process, and it was also relatively effective. But then in 1774, 400 years after his death, the tomb of Edward I was opened, and what was found was incredible. It was claimed by those who opened it up that, on lifting up the lid of the tomb, the royal body was found wrapped in a strong and thick linen cloth, waxed on the inside. The head and face were covered with sundarium, or face cloth of crimson sarsenet wrapped to 3 folds, conformable to the napkins used by our Saviour in his way of crucifixion. The corpse was discovered in all of the ensigns of majesty, richly habited. The body was wrapped in a fine linen cerecloth, closely fitted to every part of the body, even to the very fingers and face. The writs ordering the renewal of the waxen covering of the body of King Edward I being extant gave rise to this search. Over the cerecloth was a tunic of red silk damask. Above that, a stole of thick white tissue crossed the breast, and on this, a 6-inch distant from each other, quarterfolis of filigree, work of gilt metal set with stones, imitating rubies, sapphires, and amethysts, and the intervals between the quarterfoils on the stole, powdered with minute white beads, tacked down into the most elegant embroidery, in form not unlike what is called a true lover's knot. Above these habits was the royal mantle of rich crimson satin, fastened on the left shoulder with a magnificent fibula of gilt metal richly chased, and ornamented with 4 pieces of red and 4 of blue transparent paste, and 24 more pearls. The corpse from the waist downwards was covered with a rich cloth of figured gold, which fell down to the feet and was tucked beneath them. On the back of each hand was a quarterfoil like those of the stole. In the king's right hand was a sceptre with a cross of copper gilt and an elegant workmanship reaching to the right shoulder. In the left hand was the rod and dove, which passed over the shoulder and reached to the ear. The dove stood on a ball placed on 3 ranges of oak leaves of enamelled green. The dove was of white enamel. On the head was a crown chased with trefoils made of gilt metal. The head itself was lodged in the cavity of the stone coffin, always observable in those receptacles of the dead. The corpse was dressed in a conformity with ancient usage. The body of Edward I and his corpse has shown that even over 400 years after his death, his remains were in a remarkable condition, and they were very well wrapped and protected. They were so well preserved that his face was recognisable, and the skin remained on his face and body. With this, it showed the medieval techniques for embalming and preserving were successful and effective. But today, Edward I still remains inside Westminster Abbey, inside his rather plain tomb. An effigy of the king was never made, but within the tomb, the king, almost 500 years after his death, remained complete and uncorrupted with decay and rot. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And once again, thank you so much for watching.